In the first 40 days of this year, 4 Mexican journalists have been murdered in targeted killings. Even for a country that was already the world's deadliest for journalists, the surge has sparked calls for better protection and fundamental reforms. Nick Schifrin reports on a war on truth and why Mexico is unable to stop it.
To report on corruption, cartels, and violence in Mexico is to risk your life. 49-year-old photographer Margarito Martinez killed by gunmen on January 17th outside his home in Tijuana. 1 week before, in Veracruz, Jose Luis Gamboa stabbed to death. In Michoacan, on January 31st, cameraman and editor Roberto Toledo shot to death. And on January 23rd, broadcast journalist Lourdes Maldonado Lopez found murdered in her car. Back in 2019, she warned Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, her life was in danger.
I'd come here as well to ask for your support, help, and justice at my workplace, because I even fear for my life.
Today, López Obrador announced that 3 people had been arrested in her murder. But of the 133 journalists killed since 2000, more than 90% have gone unpunished. And when journalists recently held a vigil, the names and faces of their murdered colleagues filled the Interior Ministry's front gate.
And to discuss this, I'm joined by Jan Albert Hodson, the Committee to Protect Journalists Mexico representative. Welcome to the NewsHour. So why do you think we've seen this spike in violence against journalists?
Well, I think what we're seeing right now is the logical result of many, many years of negligence by the Mexican state, both in being able to protect journalists and human rights defenders and in combating impunity. Mexico has long suffered from the proliferation of organized crime in much of its national territory, and the journalists are in a uniquely vulnerable position. They cover crime, they cover corruption, they cover human rights abuses. There's usually, especially in the smaller areas and the smaller towns and communities, a very small pool of journalists, so they're easily identifiable. And very often, local authorities that are colluding with organized crime are also involved in these attacks. So it's for them, it's incredibly difficult to report these crimes and to turn to anybody who might protect them.
Localization of violence is something that I asked a security expert in Mexico City, Alejandro Hope, earlier today in an interview. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
The journals that are more at risk in Mexico are the ones that are covering local news. Stories about local corruption, about local ties between politicians and government actors. Organized crime in Mexico has become much more of a local issue, and dangerously so. 20 years ago, drug trafficking and organized crime in Mexico were almost interchangeable terms. Now you have a much more diversified set of criminal actors. You have a much more fluid ecosystem.
Those more localized and varied sources of violence, has that made journalists work more dangerous?
Absolutely. We get a lot of reports from reporters who, like Margarito Martinez, the photographer who was killed in Tijuana, spend their days basically chasing violent incidents, shootouts, bodies being dropped next to roads, accidents, etc. And what we hear very often is that when these reporters are covering these kinds of incidents, that they're threatened by gangs, they're threatened by family members of victims, they're threatened by police officers, sometimes followed, and in some cases this may lead to attacks near their homes. So I think it's absolutely right what Alejandro Hope was saying, and especially given the fact that many Mexican organized criminal groups have fractured and have become much smaller, it becomes increasingly more difficult for the authorities to combat these groups and for journalists to even know where the dangers might be coming from.
Police investigations, prosecutions, they're often weak and corrupt in Mexico. Is that why we're seeing a near impunity in terms of those who commit violence against journalists?
Absolutely. And I think there are two things going on here. First, there's the very obvious collusion between agents of the state and organized crime, or the simple fact that many authorities in Mexico are willing to use extreme violence against journalists and human rights defenders. But on the other hand, there's also just the lack of interest from authorities, both federal, state, and municipal, to properly investigate these crimes. Many of the cases that we've been investigating have these elements of police officers not showing up, not taking reports seriously, not applying even the most basic due diligence work that you would expect authorities to apply. And all of that leads to a situation in which it's almost guaranteed that a crime against a journalist is never solved. With disappearances and with murders, it's almost 100%. It's the same thing with non-lethal crimes.
And what about protection? Is the government doing enough to try and protect journalists?
There are a few institutions, both on the state and federal level, that have been ostensibly created to protect journalists and human rights defenders, while most of the state agencies are only rudimentary. They exist in many states in name only, don't have their own budget, hardly have any staff, and also they have to work together with many of the police forces, for example, that are often accused of being the ones behind attacks against reporters. On the federal level, the situation is slightly better, but even there, we're talking about an institution, the federal mechanism it's called, that has very little in terms of money, resources. It has very few staff. It works completely from Mexico City, meaning that it doesn't have any regional spread, no regional representatives, and very often doesn't have the knowledge, the know-how to deal with these situations.
And finally, I wonder, in terms of López Obrador himself and his senior officials, is how they talk about, how they treat journalists, creating a culture that makes journalists' lives and work more dangerous.
I think the relationship between President López Obrador and the press has been extremely tense and strained since the beginning of his administration. He assumed office 3 years ago. And since then, he spent most of his time actually attacking reporters, disqualifying them, calling them those who are critical and independent. He calls them corrupt. He calls them right-wingers. He calls them opponents of his political project. And I think that has two very disconcerting effects. On the one hand, there's that he gives off a sign to his own institutions that journalists are not people who should be taken seriously as victims of crimes. And at the same time, he makes it much harder for organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists to convey the urgency that these crimes need to be addressed. Because, you know, he still has a very large support among the Mexican population, anywhere between 40 and 60%. And most of those people, they trust the president more than they trust most media. So to them, what he says about the media, what he says about journalists is true.
Jan Albert Holtzen, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Nick.